Violin Mastery. This audio is presented by the Jean Bechtel School for Music Press, and is part of the Artistic Coaching and Diploma program. For more information, please visit bechtelschool.com. Talks with master violinists and teachers. Comprising interviews with Issei, Kreisler, Ellman, Auer, Thibault, Heifetz, Hartmann, Maud Powell, and others. By Frederick H. Martens. Foreword. The appreciation accorded Miss Harriet Brower's admirable books on piano mastery has prompted the present volume of intimate talks with master violinists and teachers, in which a number of famous artists and instructors discuss aesthetic and technical phases of the art of violin playing in detail, their concept of what violin mastery means, and how it may be acquired. Only limitation of space has prevented the inclusion of numerous other deserving artists and teachers, yet practically all of the greatest masters of the violin now in this country are represented. That the lessons of their artistry and experience will be of direct benefit and value to every violin student and every lover of violin music may be accepted as a foregone conclusion. Violin Mastery. Eugen Issei, The Tools of Violin Mastery. Who is there among contemporary masters of the violin whose name stands for more at the present time than that of the great Belgian artist, his extraordinary temperamental power as an interpreter enhanced by 101 special gifts of tone and technique, gifts often alluded to by his admiring colleagues? For Issei is the greatest exponent of that wonderful Belgian school of violin playing which is rooted in his teachers Vieuxtemps and Wieniawski, and which, as Issei himself says, during a period covering 70 years reigned supreme at the Conservatoire in Paris in the persons of Massot, Remy, Marsic, and others of its great interpreters. What most impresses one who meets Issei and talks with him for the first time is the mental breadth and vision of the man, his kindness and amiability, his utter lack of small vanity. When the writer first called on him in New York with a note of introduction from his friend and admirer Adolfo Betti, and later at Scarsdale where, in company with his friend Thibault, he was dividing his time between music and tennis, Issei made him entirely at home, and willingly talked of his art and its ideals. In reply to some questions anent his own study years, he said, "Strange to say, my father was my very first teacher. It is not often the case. I studied with him until I went to the Liège Conservatory in 1867, where I won a second prize, sharing it with Ovide Musin, for playing Viotti's 22D concerto. Then I had lessons from Wieniawski in Brussels and studied 2 years with Vieuxtemps in Paris. Vieuxtemps was a paralytic when I came to him, yet a wonderful teacher, though he could no longer play. And I was already a concertizing artist when I met him. He was a very great man, the grandeur of whose tradition lives in the whole romantic school of violin playing. Look at his 7 concertos, of course they are written with an eye to effect, from the virtuoso's standpoint, yet how firmly and solidly they are built up. How interesting is their working out, and the orchestral score is far more than a mere accompaniment. As regards virtuose effect only Paganini's music compares with his, and Paganini, of course, did not play it as it is now played. In wealth of technical development, in true musical expressiveness Vieuxtemps is a master. A proof is the fact that his works have endured 40 to 50 years, a long life for compositions. Joachim, Leonard, Sivori, Wieniawski, all admired Vieuxtemps. In Paganini's and Locatelli's works the effect, comparatively speaking, lies in the mechanics, but Vieuxtemps is the great artist who made the instrument take the road of romanticism which Hugo, Balzac and Gautier trod in literature. And before all the violin was made to charm, to move, and Vieuxtemps knew it. Like Rubinstein, he held that the artist must first of all have ideas, emotional power, his technique must be so perfected that he does not have to think of it. Incidentally, speaking of schools of violin playing, I find that there is a great tendency to confuse the Belgian and French. This should not be. They are distinct, though the latter has undoubtedly been formed and influenced by the former. Many of the great violin names, in fact, Vieuxtemps, Leonard, Marsic, Remy, Parent, De Bro, Musin, Thomson, are all Belgian. Issay's repertory. Issay spoke of Vieuxtemps' repertory, only he did not call it that. He spoke of the Vieuxtemps compositions and of Vieuxtemps himself. Vieuxtemps wrote in the grand style, his music is always rich and sonorous. If his violin is really to sound, the violinist must play Vieuxtemps, just as the cellist plays Servais. You know, in the Catholic Church, at Vespers whenever God's name is spoken, we bow the head. And Wieniawski would always bow his head when he said, Vieuxtemps is the master of us all. I have often played his fifth concerto, so warm, brilliant and replete with temperament, always full-sounding, rich in an almost unbounded strength. Of course, since Vieuxtemps wrote his concertos, a great variety of fine modern works has appeared, the appreciation of chamber music has grown and developed, and with it that of the sonata. And the modern violin sonata is also a vehicle for violin virtuosity in the very best meaning of the word. The sonatas of César Franck, Gondy, Théodore Dubois, Licou, Vierne, Reparts, Lazari, they are all highly expressive, yet at the same time virtuose. The violin parts develop a lovely song line, yet their technique is far from simple. Take Licou's splendid sonata in G major, rugged and massive, making decided technical demands, it yet has a wonderful breadth of melody, a great expressive quality of song. These works, those who have heard the master play the beautiful Lazari sonata this season will not soon forget it, are all dedicated to Issay. And this holds good, too, of the César Franck sonata. As Issay says, performances of these great sonatas call for two artists, for their piano parts are sometimes very elaborate. César Franck sent me his sonata on September 26, 1886, my wedding day. It was his wedding present. I cannot complain as regards the number of works, really important works, inscribed to me. There are so many, by Chausson, his symphony, Reparts, Dubois, his sonata, one of the best after Franck, Gondy, the I-star variations and other works, Gabriel Fauré, the quintet, Debussy, the quartet. There are more than I can recall at the moment, violin sonatas, symphonic music, chamber music, choral works, compositions of every kind. Debussy, as you know, wrote practically nothing originally for the violin and piano, with the exception, perhaps, of a work published by Durand during his last illness. Yet he came very near writing something for me. 15 years ago he told me he was composing a nocturne for me. I went off on a concert tour and was away a long time. When I returned to Paris I wrote to Debussy to find out what had become of my nocturne. And he replied that, somehow, it had shaped itself up for orchestra instead of a violin solo. It is one of the trois nocturnes for orchestra. Perhaps one reason why so much has been inscribed to me is the fact that as an interpreting artist, I have never cultivated a specialty. I have played everything from Bach to Debussy, for real art should be international. Issay himself has an almost marvelous right arm and fingerboard control, which enables him to produce at will the finest and most subtle tonal nuances in all bowings. Then, too, he overcomes the most intricate mechanical problems with seemingly effortless ease. And his tone has well been called golden. His own definition of tone is worth recording. He says it should be in music what the heart suggests, and the soul expresses. The tools of violin mastery. With regard to mechanism, Issay continued, at the present day the tools of violin mastery, of expression, technique, mechanism, are far more necessary than in days gone by. In fact they are indispensable, if the spirit is to express itself without restraint. And the greater mechanical command one has the less noticeable it becomes. All that suggests effort, awkwardness, difficulty, repels the listener, who more than anything else delights in a singing violin tone. Vieuxtemps often said, pas de trait pour le trait, chantez, chantez. Not runs for the sake of runs, sing, sing. Too many of the technicians of the present day no longer sing. Their difficulties, they surmount them more or less happily, but the effect is too apparent, and though, at times, the listener may be astonished, he can never be charmed. Agile fingers, sure of themselves, and a perfect bow stroke are essentials, and they must be supremely able to carry along the rhythm and poetic action the artist desires. Mechanism becomes, if anything, more accessible in proportion as its domain is enriched by new formulas. The violinist of today commands far greater technical resources than did his predecessors. Paganini is accessible to nearly all players. Vieuxtemps no longer offers the difficulties he did 30 years ago. Yet the woodwind, brass and even the string instruments subsist in a measure on the heritage transmitted by the masters of the past. I often feel that violin teaching today endeavors to develop the aesthetic sense at too early a stage. And in devoting itself to the head it forgets the hands, with the result that the young soldiers of the violinistic army, full of ardor and courage, are ill-equipped for the great battle of art. In this connection there exists an excellent set of Etudes Caprices by E. Chaumont, which offer the advanced student new elements and formulas of development. Though in some of them the frame is too large for the picture, and though difficult from a violinistic point of view, they lie admirably well up the neck, to use one of Vieuxtemps's expressions, and I take pleasure in calling attention to them. When I said that the string instruments, including the violin, subsist in a measure on the heritage transmitted by the masters of the past, I spoke with special regard to technique. Since Vieuxtemps there has been hardly one new passage written for the violin, and this has retarded the development of its technique. In the case of the piano, men like Godowsky have created a new technique for their instrument, but although Saint-Saëns, Bruch, Lalo and others have in their works endowed the violin with much beautiful music, music itself was their first concern, and not music for the violin. There are no more concertos written for the solo flute, trombone, etc. As a result there is no new technical material, added to the resources of these instruments. In a way the same holds good of the violin. New works conceived only from the musical point of view bring about the stagnation of technical discovery. The invention of new passages, of novel harmonic wealth of combination is not encouraged. And a violinist owes it to himself to exploit the great possibilities of his own instrument. I have tried to find new technical ways and means of expression in my own compositions. For example, I have written a divertiment for violin and orchestra, in which I believe I have embodied new thoughts and ideas, and have attempted to give violin technique a broader scope of life and vigor. In the days of Viotti and Rode the harmonic possibilities were more limited, they had only a few chords and hardly any chords of the ninth. But now harmonic material for the development of a new violin technique is there. I have some violin studies in Ms., which I may publish some day, devoted to that end. I am always somewhat hesitant about publishing. There are many things I might publish, but I have seen so much brought out that was banal, poor, unworthy, that I have always been inclined to mistrust the value of my own creations rather than fall into the same error. We have the scale of Debussy, and his successors to draw upon, their new chords and successions of fourths and fifths, for new technical formulas are always evolved out of and follow after new harmonic discoveries, though there is as yet no violin method which gives a fingering for the whole tone scale. Perhaps we will have to wait until Chrysler or I will have written one which makes plain the new flowering of technical beauty, and aesthetic development which it brings the violin. As to teaching violin, I have never taught violin in the generally accepted sense of the phrase. But at Godin, where I usually spent my summers when in Europe, I gave a kind of traditional course in the works of Vieuxtemps, Wieniawski and other masters to some 40 or 50 artist students who would gather there, the same course I look forward to giving in Cincinnati, to a master class of very advanced pupils. This was and will be a labor of love, for the compositions of Vieuxtemps and Wieniawski especially are so inspiring and yet, as a rule, they are so badly played, without grandeur or beauty, with no thought of the traditional interpretation, that they seem the piecework of technic factories. Violin Mastery. When I take the whole history of the violin into account, I feel that the true inwardness of violin mastery is best expressed by a kind of threefold group of great artists. First, in the order of romantic expression, we have a trinity made up of Corelli, Viotti, and Vuitton. Then there is a trinity of mechanical perfection, composed of Locatelli, Tartini and Paganini, or, a more modern equivalent, Cesar Thompson, Kubelik, and Burmeister. And, finally, what I might call in the order of lyric expression, a quartet comprising Issei, Thibaut, Misha Elman and Sammartini of Chicago, the last named a wonderfully fine artist of the lyric or singing type. Of course there are qualifications to be made. Locatelli was not altogether an exponent of technique. And many other fine artists besides those mentioned share the characteristics of those in the various groups. Yet, speaking in a general way, I believe that these groups of attainment might be said to sum up what violin mastery really is. And a violin master. He must be a violinist, a thinker, a poet, a human being. He must have known hope, love, passion and despair. He must have run the gamut of the emotions in order to express them all in his playing. He must play his violin as Pan played his flute. In conclusion, Issei sounded a note of warning for the too ambitious young student and player. If art is to progress, the technical and mechanical element must not, of course, be neglected. But a boy of 18 cannot expect to express that to which the serious student of 30, the man who has actually lived, can give voice. If the violinist's art is truly a great art, it cannot come to fruition in the artist's teens. His accomplishment then is no more than a promise which finds its realization in and by life itself. Yet Americans have the brains as well as the spiritual endowment necessary to understand and appreciate beauty in a high degree. They can already point with pride to violinists who emphatically deserve to be called artists, and another quarter century of artistic striving may well bring them into the front rank of violinistic achievement.